Hi. Uh, Hi, I'm Simon Moakes, and I work at the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture in Switzerland. And I've been the co-web package one lead in GenTORE together with my colleague Florian Leiber, who's also at Fiedel in Switzerland. And today we're going to talk you through the kind of setting the scene for GenTORE. So this was the web package, the first web package in GenTORE, and we kind of looked at the big picture. What does resilience and efficiency look like at the kind of system level in Europe for cattle farming? So really, this work package kind of set the scene and tried to set the scene for the for the whole project. And it started off really by trying to characterize cattle systems. So we know in Europe there's many different systems, and so we looked to try to, how do we define them though? What are the differences? How do we define them? And then we moved on to an analysis of looking at the current efficiency levels of the systems. This was followed up then by looking at the resilience. Resilience is a buzzword at the moment, and we wanted to look at whether the location or the farm type or other factors affected the resilience of cattle systems. And in a final step in work package one, from our work, we also looked at how climate change might impact these systems in Europe. We know the climate is changing, and what might be the impacts of these in the future. So the first question: why describe environments? We kind of, as you can see in these pictures, the production environment can be very variable. Both of these pictures of cattle systems in Switzerland, maybe the one on the left is what we think of, the cows in the mountains and so on, but actually the one on the right is also happening. There are lots of cows indoors eating silage as well. So these are two Swiss systems, but obviously very different in how we would look at them and characterize them. And this can, of course, cause interactions with this kind of the genetics of the animal and trying to have the right genetics for the animal, right environment. This G by E interaction, which much of the rest of the project has looked at as well. But how do we describe these environments? We kind of all have an understanding of the production environment, but how do we define it? What is it? So the big factors: climatic situation. Where is the farm? What is the climate like? Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it cold winters or mild winters? And this then also influences, of course, the forage type. So is it grass-based? Is it maize-based? Or is it more diverse, more kind of forage cropping, say, in the lowlands where you've got this diversity in a rotation or something? Also, of course, the level of concentrate feeding, and this can be either sourced on the farm or this can be an externally sourced concentrate. Particularly maybe proteins are often purchased, and how much is in the diet. Housing. Some systems are housing all year round, others are just minimally housing, just in the winter or even just for part of the winter. This is another factor. There's many other factors, of course, disease, challenges, things like this, and situations. And also the economics. What are the economics? What's the milk price? What's the cost of concentrates? And many other factors, such as the capital requirements of the farm. So the way the issue we have is how to define this production environment in a consistent way and move forward then once we defined it. So we know in Europe there's a diverse climate range, and this has already been looked at many times before. And you can see in this map that this was a definition developed by Mark Metzger, 2005, and you can see there's a big diversity through from the kind of the north all the way down to the south. From alpine regions and then across lowlands kind of thing, but still Atlantic, strong influence of the Atlantic, and then through, of course, to the Mediterranean, but then also there's upland areas in the Mediterranean as well as the beach, as we think so. But then, of course, that's just one part. Then the next part is how to get the definition of the systems from other data. And in Web Package 1, we use the Farm Accountancy Data Network data. So this is a large farm economic database collecting data on farms in every country in the EU. And we tried to bring that together then, so together with the climate data. And you can see that it's kind of, this is defined by nuts. Usually, you can see where the data is collected, so which nuts do regions. So, and you can see, say, on this map, you see the dark green regions on this map are where the most livestock are, and so on. So this, as you can see, we're beginning to kind of define things in multiple layers to achieve a classification of the cattle systems. And so how to integrate the data? The issue was that the economic and the kind of structural data was really at the NUTS2 level. We didn't know exactly where each farm was, of course. And then we could kind of bring in the climate data. So the way we did this was using a statistical method called the latent class analysis. And then we kind of defined each region by its climate. And then we put the economic and the farm system data on top of that. So then we ended up with this kind of integrated data set, and so for each farm, then we knew which region it was, and so on. So we were able to then develop further classifications of the farm system then. So a lot of text here, but so basically through the use of this FADN data, and then we brought in the climatic data from this other data set called Agri-Forecast. And then we were able to build a kind of data set. I mean, this was a large data set of 140,000 dairy farms and 54,000 beef farms. And as I said, we used this latent class analysis method to kind of build homogeneous climate groups at the NUTS2 level. So we're able to put all the farms in one region into this climate zone. And then within that climate zone, of course, then you have different farm types. And then this is the next step, was then to look at how do those farms vary within that region. And we chose typically such as like grass, those that are really purely based on grass. Those were grass mixed, where they maybe have a bit of maize or a small area of cropping, and then more mixed systems where they really have a diverse kind of rotation, and the livestock, the cattle, are just part of a mixed farm system. There were also the fourth kind of class of farms where we called them kind of industrial, but this is where they had a very, very high stocking density, usually feedlot or indoor type, very indoor based systems that are not so connected to the land around them. And then, so this went through, and then we were also able to define them by altitude. So we knew for each farm their approximate altitude, and so we were then able to split this further into kind of lowland and upland farms. So this was 600 meters was the defining boundary here. And then we were able to create values, average values for each of these groups. So we put all the data together and then created average data. And so this was then the typology system. So we had, it's complex, I won't go through everything, but basically the farms come in on the data set here, and then we feed them through to try and define, are they dairy, are they beef, do they have suckler cows, and so on, to subdivide them. And then they get split by the altitude zone as the first layer, and then the climate zone or climate zone class is the next one. And then within that, then they were split according to, say, stocking density, forage type, and whether they were hill farms or we call them mountain farms here. So, and then each farm was defined into this, and then they ended up in a data set, which you don't need to see the individual lines here, but this was basically the data set then of all the farms that we were able to use then for subsequent analysis. And this was the kind of process of trying to define different farm types within the different climatic regions and different farm systems we have in Europe. And from this data set, so of individual farms classified into different types, we then tried to look at their efficiency. So we had data for the last 10 years, and we tried to use, we used something called the Cobb-Douglas production function to estimate basically how efficiently these farms were using the inputs that they were putting in. So this included feed and fertilizer and labor and other inputs. And so then the idea is that you work out, okay, how efficiently is this farm turning those inputs into milk as an output? Because primarily we were looking at dairy farms on this particular analysis, but also there's beef. We then did the beef separately as well. But it wasn't so easy to define the beef because there's less data, less production data available in the FADN data set. We only have animals sold. We don't have the kilos of carcass and things like this. Whereas the milk, you have the liters of milk per cow per year. But the conclusion of this analysis, the main one, was that the dairy sector is very efficient. We saw probably across the sector, it's over 90% efficient, which is a very high level. Beef sector is not that much lower. It's a little, but probably circa 80% is the average score coming out. And this chart shows dairy, and it shows the dairy in different regions. So this NAT is the North Atlantic. Then we have West Atlantic. So West Atlantic would be the Netherlands, Western France, some of Northern Germany, Denmark, and then moving up into Scandinavia in the Boreal region. And then we have the continental and southern, and then we have the upland farms all grouped together. And you can see that for most of the farms, you see they are really, the technical efficiency score is increasing. So this is like 100% technical efficiency. And then this is kind of the number of farms, the percentage of farms within each group. And you can see that for many of the groups, they are really high. They are kind of heading north of 90% to 95% or higher. The upland farms and also the southern group farms, southern continental farms, showed more variation. And you can see that they start kind of increasing the numbers, and then they're peaking not so much lower. Probably the majority of the farms are still between 85 and 95%, but a little bit lower. But this is mainly due to the big variation in those farms. So it was harder, particularly for the upland farms, because we grouped them all the way from the North Atlantic all the way down to the Mediterranean. So they're a very diverse group. So, of course, once we get the efficiency score, we then want to look, okay, well, what are the key drivers of this efficiency? And the analysis found that in terms of stocking density and dairy specialization, so how specialized were the farms towards dairying? And this was very important factors for favoring efficiency in the North Atlantic region, while other determinants were farm size and even kind of summer heat were also positive factors. Maybe more warmth in the summer is helping those in the farms in the further north to grow more grass. But then you go a little bit further south to the West Atlantic region, very, very obviously dominated by dairying. And this found that drought in spring and summer had a negative effect. So maybe being further south, a dry summer is already having a negative effect on their ability to produce milk, the efficiency of their process. This had a negative effect on efficiency. And also with many of the types, we saw this kind of decreasing efficiency over time, which could be possibly due to decreasing margins over feed costs, or also potentially difficulties in the farms actually adapting to structural changes. So the farms are getting bigger. Maybe there's more challenges in terms of costs, input costs, compared to what they're able to produce. We also undertook this for beef, and because the beef systems are very, very diverse, and we have many different factors. We have suckler cow systems, we have finishing systems, and so on. So it was harder to tell, but in general, farm size was a positive factor towards efficiency, and also feed expenditure. Maybe this isn't a kind of intensity, so the outputs were higher when they were feeding more. We also saw the warm summers was a negative factor there, particularly in Central Europe. And then beyond efficiency, we then looked at resilience. The resilience is kind of taking things over a longer time scale. So you can measure kind of efficiency, or maybe even on a single year, but resilience is harder to measure. How do you determine if a farm is resilient over time? And so what we looked at was this time period, 2005 to 2013, the data we had. And then we compared the gross margin from year to year. And then this was, of course, averaged by the regions and also by the different farm types. And so we were able to try and understand, how did their margins change each year, and what was the change from that year to the next year? Did it go up? Did it go down? And particularly then we kind of tried to look at the challenges they might have faced. And so by looking at this, we sort of saw that there was this big challenge for milk pricing. There was the crisis in the dairy industry, 2007 to 2009, this period. And so we looked at this factor as a test of resilience to the systems. rather than looking at when the margins went up, we looked at the resilience as a test of resilience as when the margins went down. So you can see from the beginning 2007, this was kind of indexed from year one. And you can see that they were kind of okay, 2008, but then there was a big drop in 2009 combined with this drop in milk price. And you can see that nearly all the farm types decreased in their margin that year. So a big challenge to resilience. But you can also see that the next year in 2010, there was a big bounce back, and they were almost back to the same level in 2010 as they were in 2008. So you can argue that these farms were the majority, these regions, the farms in these regions were resilient to this price challenge. They bounced back quickly. You can see that, and it carried on. I mean, there was another small dip in 2012, but you can see that the boreal region, the light gray one, reacted differently to the other regions. And it suffered less of a drop in 2009, but it then suffered a much bigger drop in 2012, and then even further in 2013. So the margins were really challenged there, big drops, and probably related to price factors. There's a combination of cost increases for feed, but also then milk price challenges as well. So in terms of the determinants of resilience and efficiency in these farms, we found a higher level of efficiency in dairy than beef. But when we statistically challenged this, many of the differences were not significant variables. But we did see efficiency, farm size, specialization had an impact. And for resilience, again, the specialization, so this kind of pushing towards a specialization into dairy, beef. And also we also saw, as you can see in brackets, farm size. For some types, this was also a positive factor in resilience. But we also saw negative facts, such as, say, more grass on mixed farms was determined as a negative factor, which may seem a little surprising, but I think it probably represents the fact that more grass on a mixed farm was probably maybe a link to land quality. So we could see farms that were less able to grow crops, they grow a bit more grass maybe, and then that they have a lower level of resilience. But because we're looking across the whole of Europe, there's a very diverse picture. So getting any really strong messages was quite difficult without going to different regions, and this would take a lot more time to go through. External factors, drought and dry periods had a negative impact in, say, the west of Europe. But when you went further north, we actually saw that this kind of drought or periods of dry weather were actually having a positive impact on their efficiency and resilience. So it possibly depends on the existing climate. And maybe in the west, they already are suffering some dryness in the summer. And this is accentuated, whereas in the north, maybe some dry periods are actually resulting in better weather for higher quality forage production. So this was looking really at the data in the past so far, and this was historical data. So then we wanted to look, okay, well, what are the potential impacts in the future on the productivity of EU dairy farms? We know that most European dairy systems, in particular, they're forage-based, and climate change already is impacting forage production. And we know that because of the diversity of climate regions and farm systems in Europe, there's likely to have different impacts on different farms and different regions. So the need for resilient production systems is clear and increasingly urgent as well. We know climate is changing, so we need to be resilient, and food production needs to remain resilient during this. So therefore, we aim to assess the impacts of climate change on the productivity of dairy farms across this kind of wide range of systems and climates. So in terms of the method we used the same data set basically as we had before, only we added the GAEZ, which is agro potential data from the FAO. And this gives predicted climate impacts on production of forages and crops. And so this was an additional layer that we added to our existing data set of farms within the different climate regions. So we had the same farm groups and so on, same climatic regions. We just added then this additional layer of data to this to the data set to model. And then in terms of the scenarios, we looked at the average yield for the different forages in the different regions. So each region had its own forage production yields and crop yields. We looked at the historical data set, so the baseline data, 1961 to 2000. Then we looked at the 2030s. So this is kind of now, when a little bit ahead, 2011 to 2040. And then in the 2050s, so 2041 right up to 2070. We applied one of the Hadley models. So this was to set the scenario of climate change. And this was IPCC scenario A. So the most extreme one to see what changes would happen under potentially the most extreme changes. And all the statistics, the GAEZ layers. So this was all the yield data for the forages and the crops was applied at different altitudes and according to the NUTS2 regions. So we tried to make it as accurate as we could to estimate regional yields, both now and then in the future. So basically, we used then to do this for the future. We calculated milk production based using a model developed on the existing data, so on the historical data set. This equation was constructed on a per forage hectare basis. So we wanted to account for the stocking density as part of this, because obviously the land area was usually the limiting factor to the production. And so this kind of a linear regression was set up to build the using the basal causal relationships between milk yield and then these independent variables. And then the equation was used then to predict the milk forage per hectare, both in the midterm and then in these long-term future scenarios. And as I said before, the forage yields were specific to each type. So we had pasture, maize, alfalfa to kind of predict these kind of forage crops, legume forage crops and so on. And this was specified then for the baseline, medium and longer term. So for each of these types of forage, we had a current yield, medium term, and then long-term yield, which is part of this equation, which you can see here. So this was the production, parameterized production of milk, and then we had the forage yield, the non-fodder yield, homegrown sort of non-fodder costs, and then purchase concentrate costs, purchase fodder, and some other costs as part of machinery costs and so on as part of the equation. And the whole idea of this was to develop to estimate the future milk production based on this the values currently. And so then in the future, we had, say, the maize crop, and this was the baseline. Then we go forward to 2030 and 2050. And if you see it getting darker green, then we see the yield is increasing. But if it's going more lighter colored, then we're suffering a yield loss. And so we had maize, we had pasture grass, pasture legumes, and then alfalfa in our equations. And this was all assuming kind of rain-fed, high-intensity production, so typical of most of Europe. And you can see that some, say like maize, actually got greener in the east, but you can see then it was getting yellow areas were getting larger in the south, say in central Spain. And this kind of varied for different crops. Again, you can see pasture legumes, some are going yellower in the further south, but then also we see some improvements, some darker greens in further north. So what does this mean for milk productivity? So this was the baseline, and this was the intensity, the kind of milk production kilograms per hectare in the baseline data. And you can see there's a lot of milk production, say Denmark, Holland, into the UK, but also in northern Italy and the Po Valley and so on. And then you can see by 2030, we're starting to see some changes. So basically red shows a negative change, and then the green obviously is a positive change. And so you can see that we're kind of picking up, more and more red as we go to 2050 in, say, central France, northern Italy, and further east as well, actually. But then you see some of the areas are starting to go green as well. So we have really, really dark greens as we go further north into Denmark in particular, but also into even central Sweden, and also parts of kind of northern and western UK. And into Eastern Europe. So what does this actually mean by the different regions? So this is then showing you the predicted milk production per forage hectare, both for the light color is the baseline, and then we have the medium, and then we have the long term, the future. So this is the 2030, and this is the 2070 up to 2070. And you can see that for some regions, we see negative. So some in the central region, the Mediterranean, and also in the uplands in the Mediterranean, you can see there's red. I mean, particularly the southern and central area, you can see it's quite steep. But we also see some increases, such as the boreal region in Scandinavia, also two upland regions, the Atlantic upland and also the central uplands. We actually see an increase in production because the growing season is getting longer in these regions. So there is some positivity. And then when we look for different farm types, there was really very little difference, which was surprising because I thought there would be more differences. But I think the farm types are really spread across Europe even. So actually, we only really see a consistent trend in the upland areas, where we also see the temperatures rising and more production. The production season gets longer. So overall, the results of this part of the work were that some regions are really expected to suffer. I think we see southern areas, especially France, northern Italy, but also some areas in the East Hungary. We saw the red areas, and this will negatively impact milk productivity. However, northern regions and upland areas can actually expect increased productivity. And it seems like the grassland farm types were the least impacted, but because their yields are stable, the yields are changing less on grassland farms than they are on some of the cropping systems. And kind of in conclusion from this, they really provide an indication of priority regions where we need to think about changing things. They're like a red warning light, as we saw on the map. There are some regions which are red, and for these regions, I'm sure the farmers are already seeing changes. We are aware of changes, and therefore mitigation already needs to begin. And one options are to adapt the forage crop choice. We saw already that there is a potential to change the forages, whether it's a full change of the whole species, say from grass, or I don't know, maybe moving from maize to alfalfa or something that doesn't require so much water. Or it could be actually just a change of the balance in a grass sward. But even now, we saw that potentially some areas are not using the forages with the highest yields. And obviously, there can be agronomic reasons for this, but there is potential there to actually mitigate some of this. And we could see that if some adaptations were made, then mitigation was usually possible. But there are some positives, of course. There's negatives, but there's also, so for the majority of producers, we saw the impact is probably is not so negative. It's probably limited, and in some northern regions, it may even be positive. However, other factors such as the potential of more erratic weather, and we've seen heat waves in the past. We've also seen, flooding as well, like last summer. So it can be balanced. The climate change is not always consistent, is it? So it's not just a steady increase in temperature. It's also far more erratic weather. And we also had the severe droughts in Sweden a couple of years ago. So even where we see like general positives, maybe it actually doesn't mean it's going to be positive every year. And farmers obviously need buffers to keep the resilience, to maintain resilience in these challenging years. And that's the conclusion, really. And this was just really an introduction and a rapid overview of some of the work in Work Package 1. And this provided really the context to a lot of the work in the rest of the project, where they looked at really more at how the breeding can tackle these challenges that we face. So thank you very much for your attention.